Okay, so now we're gonna move on to this HL only topic, okay? The last one of Unit 2, Industrial Employee Relations 2.7. Now, I'm gonna say this topic is very, very important because it always shows up in exams, okay? So I'm telling you, if there's a topic if there's only one topic to revise out of HR, I would do industrial employee relations if you're HL, because this continuously shows up in every single exam. So let's get into it. What is industrial conflict? Industrial conflict is this idea or this sense of conflict that arises between employees and employers, okay, when there's a severe or when there's a strong difference of opinions about issues at work, okay? So these sources of conflicts, the ideas, the difference of opinions, okay, about issues at work is talking about these, okay? These are the sources of conflict that ensure a industrial conflict, as we call it. So first is poor communication, okay? This idea of miscommunication, misinformation, okay, misconceptions within your business can create this conflict, okay? So that is why communication is so important to maintain effective, accurate, okay, and reliable. Secondly is this idea of contrasting needs and wants. Maybe there's been change that's occurred to yours that has contrasting needs between your stakeholders. Maybe shareholders want higher dividends, so you have to cut the wages of employees. So that's going to clear contrasting needs and wants and is a source of conflict. And third is pay disputes. This one is literally the most common source of industrial conflict in all businesses, okay? Workers are not happy with the conditions, the working conditions they've been placed under, or the pay disputes, or how much they're being paid compared to the industry levels or compared to other people and things in the business. Fourth, we have this idea of a contrasting values and visions between individuals. So maybe people where like the employees, okay, have been told they have to reach this amount of targets by the managers, but the employees just know that is so unachievable. So they're trying to tell them like, no, we can't reach that. Or this idea of too much of a workload. There's given too much to do that they cannot do, okay? So this idea of contrasting values and visions, okay? And last, we have this idea of power struggles, okay? Power struggles between people who are fighting for power, who have power and abuse power of the other people, is a source of industrial conflict. And yeah, this is the basics of it, and we'll get into how employees deal with industrial conflict and how employers deal with industrial conflict. Okay, so as I was saying, employees have objectives and their methods in order to deal with industrial conflicts. So what they try to achieve is this increased pay, more paid holidays, better fringe benefits, improved working hours and rest breaks, training and development of themselves. They are just trying to achieve and counteract these sources of conflicts that actually result in industrial conflict. Okay, so when we talk about employees, there are three things employees can do in a business or just deal with industrial conflict. So I've done it in a scale where it goes from least disruptive to the business to most disruptive to the business, okay? And basically, the three things they can do is collective bargaining at the least disruptive, work to rule, which is in the middle option, and then strike action, which is the most disruptive to the business. So let's look at collective bargaining first. When I talk about collective bargaining, that basically refers to this idea where trade unions will come into the business, okay, and trade union representatives that the employees are part of will come in and compromise and negotiate with business managers and CEOs and senior levels of authority in order to actually achieve what they want, okay? So this is this sense of negotiation and compromise that occurs within a business. Now, this is on the least disruptive side because employees are still doing their work. Maybe they hold a little bit of resentment, maybe they're not as productive as they used to be, and maybe managers are very preoccupied with dealing with these trade union representatives when they could be doing other work. So it's at the least disruptive still because it's not as disruptive to the business's actual practices, operations, and revenue making processes as these others. So this is likely the first step people would take, okay? Because you'll likely go here, and if the trade union representative is not able to come to a compromise, okay, and they're not able to come to a favorable negotiated agreement with these managers, then they move on to step 2. This is what we call work to rule, okay? Now, this is when trade unions and all these people actually do their work and all band together to simultaneously work together and better their working conditions. So this is when trade unions will tell individuals in the trade union, in the business, to work and only work according to what their contract says and do not do anything extra. When you get hired to a business, you have a normally in your contract of employment, there is a bare minimum amount of output of work you have to do in order to stay hired. So this idea of work to rule says you limit your working to that minimum amount. Now you make sure you reach, so let's say your contract, so you have to produce 20 levels, okay, and your normal day you can produce 40 levels. You never go above 20 levels in your day, okay? So you're doing the bare minimum you do for your business, all right? That is what we call work to rule. The reason this is in the middle of the scale is because it is the second step when collective bargaining doesn't work. And this seeks out a business's attention severely because these targets that are in contracts of employees are the bare minimums. So they're not really enough for businesses to keep afloat. This means their productivity drops so much that they may not be able to still stay competitive within their business, forcing them to take actions. So usually trade unions will come back into the situation and make further agreements with managers, showing them that they have power, okay? But once again, if work to rule does not work, collective bargaining is still not working, then we move on to step 3, strike action. Now this is the most disruptive towards a business because strike action is when literally outright all workers just don't go to work, okay? In the factory, if you have 100 hot dog makers, okay, this will be that all 100 of those workers will not show up. So as you can tell, this is the most disruptive because it plummets a business's productivity all the way to 0. So work to rule, you may have been working at a minimum that's not sustainable for a business. Strike action, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. So when you come to strike action, your business now has no other choice but to negotiate to your terms, okay? So this is not only harmful towards businesses, but it can also harm local communities because now that maybe the business was essential to the local community and producing products, now that now that the business is not able to produce anything, the local community is not able to get any goods or services as well. So overall, the methods for employees, these all make businesses, the target is to make your business productivity go down until your employers are forced to change, okay? Forced to go about in a change so that you can actually get your favorable terms and agreements. Now, this may sound like employees get whatever they want, but employers also have their own methods to deal with industrial conflict. So, now we've covered that. Employees, they go about into 3 steps when they want to get their favorable outcome in industrial conflicts. They first try collective bargaining. If that doesn't work, they move on to work to rule. If that doesn't work, they move on to strike action. So, and a key thing to know about collective bargaining is it does happen throughout all processes because when work to rule is happening, then collective bargaining will also happen but now the trade union just hold more power. And then back again in strike actions, the trade union holds a lot more power over the business because they're able to outright stop their productivity. So, yeah. That is employees and what they can do in an industrial conflict. Okay, so now we've covered what employees can do. Now let's cover what employers can do, so the managers, okay? So, sorry. The objectives of employers kind of stem down to one or two things. It is to improve productivity rates and just lower costs. So obviously the employer's objectives is first going to be to lower the production cost. They want it to be as cheap as possible to earn as much revenue as possible. Secondly, we have this idea of improving the productivity rates, okay? They want better productivity rates. They want greater output. They want greater sales. Third, they want lower absenteeism rates so that more employees show up all the time so that the productivity increases. Fourth, we want high staff retention. We want the staff to be fully on top of it. We don't want slack. We don't want any bad quality work, okay? So, methods for employers. What can employers do? Firstly, it starts in it goes in least disruptive towards employees to the most disruptive towards employees, and also it can be to the business. So there is actually 5 steps for employers, okay? But I'm gonna say this now, these 2 are quite unrealistic, so realistically it's only these 3. But, okay, so it starts off the same way with collective bargaining. It's this negotiation with the trade unions and representatives and us as employers, okay, to come to agreements. If that does not work, okay, and the trade unions maybe are too stubborn and not budging, okay, or we are too stubborn and not budging, then they move on to this idea of threat of redundancies, okay? A redundancy is this idea of laying off individuals when your business is cutting costs, okay? So this can literally scare employees to be like, okay, I may just not have a job anymore because they may just hire other people. However, there are like limits to this because you can't just randomly remove someone, okay? You have to like have a reason, or at least there are some employment laws to protect just random removals. Okay, but this threat of redundancies may work because it creates this disparity or this conflict between the trade unions and the employees within them, the representatives of the trade unions and the actual employees. Because realistically, the employees don't want to be redundant. They don't want to get fired. They need to get paid. If they get fired, they don't get paid, and the business can just look elsewhere for an employee, especially for low-skilled workers, okay? So this is a big manipulation tactics that a lot of businesses use. Then, if a threat of redundancies may not work, a business may move on to this idea of change of contracts, okay? So this once again can scare employees because you can change their contracts to maybe counter the work to rule, okay? Increase their minimum output they need to reach. Or there's ideas where you can change people from full-time employees to part-time employees, which will remove their fringe benefits, maybe their perks like holidays, their maybe any perks that came with it, like profit-related pay. So all of this stuff is changing contracts, changing the titles of people, their status in the organization. There's changing maybe how much they get paid, okay? These are all stuff that can scare employees and drive that drift further apart between this trade union representatives and employees, so that people who are scared will come back to the business and negotiate themselves. However, once again, like the threat of redundancies, businesses are not able to do whatever they want. Every country has their own employment laws and regulations in order to have this sense of security for employment. So, like, if you want to change your contracts, you're going to have to give them a notice saying, oh, your contract's being changed in advance. But however, even though these laws are there, it still proves as a powerful tactic to scare employees away from their trade unions to negotiate by themselves with businesses and come back. So next, we have these kind of unrealistic methods that don't usually occur, but there's always a possibility. So If none of this works, if you're not able to negotiate, if you're not able to scare people with redundancies or changing their contracts, then we can move on to lockouts, okay? Lockouts is literally when you lock your area of operation so that employees cannot enter for a certain period of time. This literally entices the idea no work, no pay, okay? If the this once again goes over to this threat of redundancies, change of contract, it's that same like method, same skill, same tactic they're using, but just at more and more extreme levels. They are literally telling their employees, if you want to act the way you act right now, you're not going to be able to work. So thus the employees will not be able to get paid. Now this once again just drives that drift between the trade union representatives and employees, and makes employees come to the businesses back by themselves away from their trade unions. And then, but obviously this sense of lockout is basically the business imposing a strike on themselves. They outright stop all of their productivity, and there's something they have to deal with. So this is a very, very extreme method, but there is more. If the lockout doesn't work, people are willing to wait for however long you want to lock it. Let's say you lock for 2 weeks and people are willing to not get paid for 2 weeks and wait until it comes back. Then there's that final measure of a closure, okay? You completely just disband the business. Now, obviously, that's just very unrealistic, but this can happen in super extreme cases. Maybe in times where strike action is going on for too long and you just can't do anything with the employees, you just tell them, okay, we're going to close the business, okay? You guys cannot seem to negotiate, you guys cannot seem to compromise, so the business is just going to shut down. This once again is the same idea as everything else. No work, no pay, like you're not gonna get paid, okay? You're gonna have to try find work elsewhere. I might, as a business, close and just open a new one later on with a completely brand new staff. So this once again further drives that bridge and that like gap between these trade union representatives and the employees, making the employees come back to the business and be like, okay, look, we'll agree for these unfavorable terms if you at least give us this. And then these are just methods where businesses can get the industrial conflict to resolve on their favorable terms. Like, these methods do sound very overwhelming, and it kind of makes you might make you question, how do like employers ever win? Well, these are very unrealistic. So honestly, in today's world, these honestly, they won't ever happen. But these three are stuff that happens almost day to day when we have to deal with industrial conflict. But this essence of the employment laws and regulations for employees' safety is what allows them. It allows the employees to have power and actual right to say something when they're not in their favorable working conditions. So it's not like the employers hold ultimate power. They can't just bully and manipulate everyone to such an extent where they always have to listen. They also have their own limit. So it just depends on how far like your negotiation and your compromise is willing to go on both sides. And that is the methods and approaches to industrial conflict, which now I will be showing you how to resolve these conflicts, okay? These are approaches to the conflict and how the conflict arises, okay? And what you do to get your favorable terms, but to actually resolve the conflicts, we have these specific methods. I will explain them in a minute. Okay, so as I was talking about, we have already talked about the approaches to conflict. We have talked about why industrial conflict happens in the first place. We've talked about the approaches for employers and employees and their aims. But now we're going to talk about this conflict resolution. Now, The reason why the collective bargaining was in both methods for employers and employees is because that's something that requires both of them to work together. And it is a big aspect of industrial employee relations. This idea of conflict resolution occurs in that part of collective bargaining, but also, as I was telling you, collective bargaining is not just one time thing where it's a continuous aspect of negotiations and attempts of compromise, okay? So within collective bargaining, these are the approaches to actual conflict resolution. So first, we have this idea of conciliation, okay? Businesses and trade unions can occur to this idea of where both parties are involved agree to use an external mediator, okay? But however, conciliation is this using an external mediator to decide a result on a dispute. Conciliation is not legally binding, whereas arbitration is the legally binding aspect, okay? It is this involving an external mediator, okay, arbitrator for an arbitration, okay, this sort of almost judge, but not really, to come in, hear both sides out, and make a final verdict. So conciliation is not legally binding, so that technically the employers don't have to follow it, but even though they come to an agreement. However, arbitration is something legally binding, so they legally have to follow the verdict. Secondly, employee participation, okay? Let's go back to conciliation. The reason people do this is because it is just, there's no bias, okay? It allows for ultimate compromise to be made because both sides are able to present why they need it, why they don't need it, okay? Or whatever change that's being made. And then the outcome that's gonna come will be in the middle. It might be towards one side or the other, but if so, it will be unbiased and it will be fair because it is a sense of compromise where both sides have agreed, okay, they will decide. So now we can move on to employee participation. This is when the businesses are trying to get the trade unions and employees on their side. It is when they're succumbing and they give the employees these responsibilities and these authorities to complete tasks and make them involved in decision making, okay? This shows that businesses are, okay, fine, we agree to some of your terms and we want to help your employees and the trade unions out. We will give the employees some responsibility. We'll give them authority to complete tasks that they were not supposed to do before. And we'll let them be involved in decision making so we don't get these problems in the future. This shows a sense of openness from your business, and as an employee, it gives you this greater sense of trust in your employers that they're open to hearing me out, and it makes you feel more valued. And third, we have this idea of a no-strike agreement, okay? This is when businesses and trade unions, okay, when trade unions have members that agree to refrain from strike action during industrial disputes. This ensures that the business is safe from strike action, which will maybe allow them to be a lot more lenient, okay? And yes, this is risky because the employers may manipulate the situation or exploit the situation within a no-strike agreement, okay, to go out of their way, but it is most likely a non-binding agreement. So that means the employers have to put up something if they want a no-strike agreement, which means that this allows for a lot of compromise without that hanging tension of a strike action, which is something that maybe like cause conflicts or cause a divide or tensions. So this no-strike agreement will allow free conversations and negotiations and compromise to occur without this fear of strike action and this like paranoia to make sure that business have to go all out to avoid it, because now they don't need to, the strike action is not there anymore. So it makes them more lenient, okay, and make them agree with trade unions more because they can see that trade unions, okay, they're fine with agreeing with no strike action and stuff like that. And lastly, we have this idea of a single union agreement. Now, trade unions are not just one thing that businesses have to deal with. There are hundreds of trade unions everywhere. Each business probably has their own trade union, and within a business there might be more than one. So, a single union agreement is when a firm agrees to participate in this idea of conflict resolution with only one trade union, okay? And this is good for trade unions because, okay, it shows them, oh, businesses are able to compromise. They want to compromise. They want to negotiate. And it's also good for businesses because they don't have to deal with such a wide variety of demands and needs that they need to fulfill. Maybe this trade union wanted increased costs, and this trade union wanted increased paydays, and this trade union wanted better working conditions. If you only had to focus on one of those trade unions, okay, this helps you a lot more as a business because you have to compromise a lot less. So a single union agreement is mutually beneficial, and so is honestly every single aspect of this conflict resolution, which is why these are the approaches to conflict resolution to solve industrial conflicts, because they are mutually beneficial to businesses and trade unions. Now, what are the actual factors to influence the outcomes of conflict resolution? What are the things that determine whether these four aspects will become successful and will actually occur? So firstly, we have to look at the skill and the experience of your negotiators. If your negotiators are very skillful, very experienced, okay, they will be very able to divulge a compromise and divulge a sense of actual negotiation with businesses to actually make some progress and movement into better favorable conditions or maybe other stuff to solve this industrial conflict. Secondly, this unity of your trade unions and employees. As I said before, the approach to conflict that employers can use, a big part of that is driving the wedge between the trade unions and the employees. So if your trade unions and your employees are strong and united, that can pose a serious threat to businesses, forcing them to abide by conflict resolution, okay, and force them to actually make change. However, if it's very disgruntled and very dismantled and fragmented, your businesses kind of have this power to do anything because the trade unions are not truly effective. So, and third, we have the economic state, an external factor rather than an internal factor now, because this general economic state will also determine the outcome of your conflict resolution. If you're in a recession, workers do not have the liberty of going off of work for so long. They don't have the liberty to, not be paid for so long. So at some point, they are going to have to come to negotiations. Fourth, it is the level of demand of a product. If your business maybe sells bread or some eggs, that is something that is needed. You need productivity to get that running, get that going. So as a business, that halt in productivity is so detrimental to you, where you are forced to come by conflict resolution and actually make change. Fifth, sometimes a factor influencing the outcome of a conflict resolution is government intervention. Maybe if your employees are treated so bad, okay, where it breaks laws, okay, the government can intervene and decide this outcome of your conflict resolution to help the employees. Or maybe if the trade unions are taking too much power, it can go and help the businesses. And finally, we have this idea of public media and opinion, okay? If you are working by the law, so the government can't do anything, but you're paying people, your workers, so little, and your conditions are so bad, it's a bare minimum, then a public opinion, negative media opinion can damage your business's publicity so much, where they are also once again forced to change. However, it can also work the other way. If your trade unions are shown to be uncompromisable, unnegotiable, okay, they are not willing to accept anything, okay, this can give the trade unions a negative bad image as well, losing their power and their credibility. So, to cover the whole unit, the reasons industrial conflicts occur is because of power disputes. Pay disputes are the most common, okay? This contrasting needs and wants between stakeholders, okay? And basically how your employees are treated. And when it comes to actually dealing with these industrial conflicts, your employees and your employers have multiple different methods they can go. Collective bargaining essentially is the most useful one because that is where the conflict resolution happens. You can conciliate, arbitrate, you can employ employee participation, you can employ no strike agreements, you can employ single union agreements, and then these factors are what's responsible for how these industrial conflicts are later result in. So that is all of industrial conflicts. Now, if I was you, I would go back to the textbook, I would go to InThinking, and I would read over this in full detail because once again, this is a very important topic that shows up in almost every exams. So, thank you.